They nailed a dead crow to the old cowboy's door before sunrise, and by noon the whole town wished they hadn't. The wind came hard through Black Hollow that morning, dragging red dust across the empty street like smoke from an unseen fire. Store signs creaked slowly overhead. Horses shifted near the hitching rail outside Doyle's saloon, restless for reasons men could not explain. Elias Boone stepped out of his cabin just after dawn with stiff knees and one hand pressed against the small of his back. 70 years had settled deep into his bones, and every cold morning reminded him of it. He noticed the crow immediately, black feathers hanging limp against old cedar wood, a railroad spike through its neck. Someone in town laughed from across the street. Another man spat tobacco into the dirt. Elias stood there quietly for several seconds beneath the pale desert light, his shadow long beside the porch steps. Then he pulled the spike free without a word. The dead bird dropped softly into his hand. He carried it behind the cabin and buried it near the fence where the ground was soft from last week's rain. No anger, no curses, just silence. That silence bothered people more than shouting ever could. By 8 o'clock the story had already spread through town. Old Elias finally got the message. He'll be gone before dark. Men gathered inside Doyle's saloon with whiskey glasses sweating in their palms while dust rattled against the windows. Sheriff Clyde Mercer leaned back in his chair near the stove, boot heels hooked against the table rail. "Town's tired of feeding ghosts," one rancher muttered. Another nodded toward the window where Elias limped slowly toward the general store. Man should have left years ago. Nobody defended him except Martha Hale, and even she kept her voice low. "He pays for what he takes," she said quietly from behind the counter. That oughta count for something. The men ignored her. Outside, Elias stopped beside the water trough and let his old bay horse drink first. He always did that, even now. Even after weeks of insults and cold shoulders and muttered threats that followed him like flies in summer heat. His coat looked older than some buildings in town. Sun-faded brown leather with one torn sleeve stitched carefully by hand. Around his wrist sat a narrow Apache bead bracelet worn smooth with age. Most people figured he kept it as some kind of war trophy. Nobody dared ask directly anymore. A pair of young ranch hands walked past him laughing under their breath. "Careful, old man," one of them said. "Buzzards already circling your place." Elias looked at the boy for a long moment. Not angry, just tired. "Ain't the buzzards you should worry about," he said softly. The boys laughed anyway and disappeared into the saloon. By afternoon, the sky turned strange over the western ridge. Thin smoke lines climbed above the distant hills where Apache land began. At first, only a few people noticed. Then more eyes turned west. Horses grew uneasy near the stable. Even Sheriff Mercer stepped outside to stare at the horizon beneath the hard white sun. Somewhere far beyond those hills, fires were burning. And on the ridge overlooking Black Hollow, almost a mile away, a single rider sat motionless against the wind, watching the town below. By late afternoon, the smoke above the western ridge had grown darker, stretching across the sky like storm clouds that refused to move. Folks in Black Hollow kept pretending not to notice it, but every few minutes another pair of eyes drifted toward the hills. The town had seen Apache smoke before. Usually it meant hunters moving camp or signal fires before winter travel. But this felt different. Too steady, too close. Elias Boone sat alone outside the general store beneath the shade of the awning, turning a small tin cup slowly between his weathered hands while dust rolled along Main Street in thin red waves. He had bought coffee beans, lamp oil, and flour. Nothing more. Never more than he needed. Martha Hale stepped outside carrying a paper-wrapped loaf of bread still warm from the oven behind the store. She placed it beside him without saying anything at first. Elias looked at the bread, then at her. "I did not pay for this." Martha brushed flour from her sleeves and glanced toward the saloon where laughter spilled through the swinging doors. "Maybe I got tired of watching. Decent people eat alone." Elias gave the faintest smile, though it disappeared almost immediately. The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of smoke down from the western hills. Somewhere nearby, a horse whinnied nervously. Martha lowered her voice. Those fires got folks uneasy. Elias stared toward the ridge for several seconds before answering. They should. That answer settled heavy between them. Martha studied the old man carefully. His gray beard moved slightly in the wind. The lines in his face looked carved there by years of sun and regret. Most people in town saw only a worn-out drifter with strange habits and a silence that made them uncomfortable. But Martha noticed things others ignored. The way Elias removed his hat whenever Apache riders passed through years ago. The way he never carried a rifle into town. The way his eyes changed whenever somebody mentioned the Western Valleys. Beneath the sleeve of his coat, the old Apache bead bracelet rested against his wrist like something sacred. "Where did you get that thing?" she asked quietly. Elias looked down at the bracelet but did not touch it. "Long time ago." "From who?" His eyes lifted toward the hills again. "Someone who should have let me die." Before Martha could ask another question, the saloon doors slammed open. Sheriff Clyde Mercer stepped outside with 2 ranchers behind him. Their boots crunched hard against the dirt as they crossed the street toward Elias. The sheriff stopped a few feet away, thumbs hooked into his belt. "Town council met," he said flatly. "Folks decided it is time you moved on." Elias took a slow sip from the tin cup. "This still a free country, Clyde?" One rancher laughed coldly. "Not for traitors." Martha stiffened immediately. "That is enough." But Mercer never looked at her. His eyes stayed fixed on Elias. "You got until tomorrow morning." The old cowboy set the cup down beside him with steady hands. "And if I stay?" Nobody answered right away. Wind rattled the loose sign overhead. Somewhere down the street, a screen door slammed shut. Finally Mercer stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Then I cannot promise what happens after dark." Elias looked at him for a long moment. Not angry, not afraid, just tired in a way younger men could never understand. Then he nodded once and stood slowly from the chair. As he walked away toward his cabin at the edge of town, Martha noticed something strange. Sheriff Mercer kept staring at the bracelet on Elias's wrist. And for the first time all day, the sheriff looked afraid. The sun disappeared behind the western ridge earlier than usual that evening, swallowed by thick smoke drifting over the desert like a dark blanket across the sky. Black Hollow grew quieter as the light faded. Even the usual laughter spilling from Doyle's saloon sounded strained now, thin and nervous beneath the steady howl of wind moving through the empty street. Elias Boone sat alone inside his cabin with a lantern burning low beside the table. The room smelled of dust, leather, and old cedar smoke. Every object around him looked worn smooth by time. A cracked coffee mug, a folded army blanket near the stove, a Bible with missing pages resting beside an oil lamp. The old cowboy slowly removed his coat and hung it near the door before lowering himself carefully into the chair beside the window. Outside, the last streaks of daylight painted the hills deep red. He stared toward the western ridge for so long it almost seemed he was waiting for something. Or someone. Then came the sound of boots outside. More than one pair. Elias did not move. The porch boards creaked softly beneath heavy steps. A shadow passed across the window. Another followed. Somebody rattled the door handle once before pushing it open without permission. 3 ranch hands stepped inside carrying the smell of whiskey and cold night air with them. Young men, loud men, the kind who mistook cruelty for courage when standing beside friends. The tallest one glanced around the cabin and laughed quietly. Sad little place for a man who thinks he owns the town. Elias stayed seated. "I do not own anything." Another man kicked lightly at a wooden crate near the stove. "Sheriff said you got until morning." "Morning is not here yet," Elias answered calmly. The third man noticed the Apache bracelet resting against the old cowboy's wrist beneath the lantern. Glow. His smile faded slightly. "There it is," he muttered. "Told you he still wore it." The tallest ranch hand stepped closer. "Where did you get that thing?" Elias said nothing. Wind pushed against the cabin walls outside. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and then stopped. "You hear me, old man?" Elias slowly looked up at him. His pale gray eyes looked tired beyond words, but steady. Some things are not yours to ask about. Silence settled heavily inside the cabin. Then one of the men spotted loose floorboards beneath the bed. What is under there? Before Elias could answer, the ranch hand crouched down and pulled up the board. Inside rested a small leather pouch darkened by age and weather. The young men exchanged uncertain glances. One carefully opened the pouch and emptied its contents onto the table beneath the lantern light. A child's feather wrapped with red thread, a faded strip of cloth stained brown with age, and a silver Apache medallion carved with the mark of a mountain hawk. The room went still. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. "Where did you get this?" the tallest ranch hand whispered, though his voice no longer carried the same confidence. Elias stared at the medallion quietly. "Put it back." But nobody moved. The youngest ranch hand leaned closer to the silver carving, and suddenly the color drained from his face. He had seen that symbol once before, burned into the wall outside an abandoned trading post 50 miles west of town. Men still talked about it in hushed voices. "That belongs to Nantan Lujan," he said softly. The lantern flame flickered hard in the silence that followed. And somewhere far beyond Black Hollow, deep in the western dark, a single horse cried out across the desert. The three ranch hands left Elias Boone's cabin without another word, and for the first time that night none of them looked eager to return to Doyle's saloon. The leather pouch stayed on the table beside the lantern where the silver medallion caught the weak yellow light. Elias remained seated long after the door closed behind them. Outside, the wind carried sand against the cabin walls in long dry whispers. He stared at the medallion quietly, his rough fingers resting near it but never touching it. Then, very slowly, he closed the pouch and slid it back beneath the loose floorboard. His movements carried the care of a man handling memory instead of metal. Across town, the mood inside Doyle's saloon had changed. The laughter was gone now. Men gathered near the bar speaking in low voices while whiskey sat untouched in cloudy glasses. Sheriff Clyde Mercer stood near the window staring into the dark street beyond. One of the ranch hands leaned close and whispered what they had found inside the cabin. At first nobody answered. Then old Walter Briggs, who had trapped beaver along Apache country 40 years earlier, slowly lowered his drink onto the counter. "You boys sure about that symbol?" he asked. "Mountain hawk carved in silver?" The youngest ranch hand nodded nervously. Walter went pale beneath his gray beard. "Lord help us." The room grew still. Even the piano player stopped moving his fingers across the keys. One cowboy near the stove laughed uneasily. "It is just a piece of silver." Walter shook his head. "No, that mark belongs to Nantan Lujan." Silence followed the name. Heavy silence. The kind that settles into a room and makes grown men suddenly aware of their own breathing. Everybody in Arizona Territory knew stories about Chief Nantan. Some said he could cross 30 miles of desert without leaving tracks. Others claimed entire posses had vanished trying to follow him into the canyon lands west of the Verde River. Most of the stories were probably lies. But fear did not care much about truth once a legend got old enough. Sheriff Mercer finally spoke. "That old man has not left Black Hollow in 20 years. Walter looked toward the window. Maybe the Apache never forgot where he was. Outside, the smoke over the western ridge continued rising into the night sky. More fires now. Too many for hunting camps. Martha Hale closed the general store early and hurried home beneath the cold wind. But she could still feel the tension moving through town like invisible thunder. Curtains shifted as people watched the street from dark windows. Horses stomped nervously inside the stable. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang once before falling silent again. Near midnight, Sheriff Mercer saddled his horse and rode alone to the edge of town. He stopped beside the old cemetery overlooking the desert valley. From there, he could see the western hills clearly beneath the moonlight. Tiny orange flames flickered along the ridges like watchfires stretching for miles. Mercer swallowed hard. Then he noticed something else. Riders. Not many. Maybe 3 or 4 shadows moving slowly across the ridgeline before disappearing again into darkness. The sheriff tightened his grip on the reins. Cold wind swept across the hill carrying the faint smell of cedar smoke and desert sage. He had not felt fear like this since he was a boy. Back then his father used to warn him never to speak certain Apache names after dark. Nantan Luhan was one of them. Mercer looked back toward Black Hollow below. Lamps still glowed inside Doyle's saloon. Men still drinking, still talking brave while hidden behind walls and whiskey. But the sheriff understood something now that the others did not. If Chief Nantan truly knew Elias Boone, then the old cowboy sitting alone in that broken cabin might be the most dangerous man any of them had ever threatened. Morning arrived cold and colorless over Black Hollow. The smoke from the western ridge still stained the sky, stretching across the desert in long gray scars beneath the rising sun. Nobody slept much the night before. Lamps had burned late behind curtained windows, and more than one rancher kept a rifle resting beside the front door until dawn finally pushed through the dark. Doyle's saloon opened early, though hardly anybody came for whiskey. Men gathered there because fear felt smaller when shared among others. Sheriff Clyde Mercer stood near the entrance with dark circles beneath his eyes, watching the empty street outside while old Walter Briggs muttered prayers into a coffee cup near the stove. Every few minutes somebody glanced west toward the ridge line, waiting, listening, hoping the smoke would disappear with daylight. It did not. Elias Boone stepped out of his cabin shortly after sunrise wearing the same faded coat and dust-covered hat. He moved slowly, one stiff step at a time, carrying a small canvas bag toward the stable at the edge of town. People watched him from windows and porches, but nobody called out anymore. The cruelty from yesterday had drained away overnight, replaced by something colder. Uncertainty. Elias reached his horse and brushed the animal gently along its neck before tightening the saddle straps. The old bay horse leaned into his hand like it trusted him more than the world around them. Martha Hale approached quietly carrying a wrapped bundle beneath her arm. "Food for the road," she said softly. Elias accepted the bundle with tired eyes. "You should not be seen helping me." Martha glanced toward town. Folks are too busy scaring themselves. For the first time in days, Elias almost smiled again. But before either could say another word, the sound reached them. Hoofbeats. Slow. Steady. Coming from the western road beyond the cemetery hill. Every conversation in town stopped at once. Men stepped out from the saloon. Curtains shifted open. Stable horses grew restless, ears twitching sharply toward the sound drawing closer through the morning wind. Sheriff Mercer moved into the middle of Main Street, one hand hanging near his revolver though he never touched it. The hoofbeats continued, calm, unhurried. Then the rider appeared through the drifting smoke at the far end of town. Alone. A tall Apache man wearing a dark buckskin coat trimmed with faded beadwork. His long gray-black hair hung loose beneath the desert wind, moving softly against his shoulders. No rifle rested across his saddle. No war paint marked his face. Yet the silence that followed his arrival weighed heavier than armed men ever could. Chief Nantan Luhan rode slowly down the center of Black Hollow while every eye in town followed him. Nobody spoke his name aloud. Nobody needed to. The stories had already done that years ago. The chief finally stopped his horse 20 feet from Elias Boone. Dust drifted between them beneath the pale morning light. Elias stood beside his old bay horse without moving, one weathered hand resting lightly against the saddle horn. For several long seconds neither man spoke. The town held its breath. Then, slowly, Chief Nantan climbed down from his horse. His boots touched the dirt with almost no sound. He walked toward Elias one measured step at a time until he stood directly before the old cowboy beneath the cold desert wind. Sheriff Mercer swallowed hard. Nobody moved. Then the Apache chief reached beneath his coat and removed a necklace made from carved bone and silver feathers. Men in town had heard stories about that necklace too. Apache warriors said Nantan wore it only before judgment. The chief looked into Elias Boone's tired gray eyes and spoke quietly enough that only the nearest people heard the words. "You should have sent for me sooner, brother." The words settled over Black Hollow like thunder rolling across dry canyon stone. Brother. Nobody in town could remember the last time silence felt so heavy. Sheriff Clyde Mercer stood frozen in the middle of the street while the wind pulled dust around his boots in slow circles. Men outside Doyle's saloon stared openly now, no longer hiding their fear behind whiskey glasses or nervous laughter. Chief Nantan Lujan lifted the silver and bone necklace carefully and placed it over Elias Boone's shoulders with both hands, the same way a preacher might place a blessing upon a man before burial. Elias lowered his eyes for a moment but said nothing. His weathered face carried sadness more than pride. Martha Hale watched from beside the stable, one hand pressed softly against her chest as if afraid to breathe too loudly. Nantan stepped back and studied the old cowboy beneath the cold morning light. "You look older than the mountains now," the chief said quietly. Elias gave a faint, tired smile. "That tends to happen when a man keeps waking up." A few uneasy chuckles escaped nobody. The town remained silent. Chief Nantan slowly turned his gaze toward the people gathered along Main Street. His eyes moved calmly from face to face. No anger, no threats. Somehow that frightened them more. "Last night," he said, "some of you entered this man's home." Nobody answered. The sound of leather saddle straps creaking in the wind seemed louder than usual. Nantan continued speaking in the same steady voice. "Some of you touched things that do not belong to you." Sheriff Mercer swallowed hard. One ranch hand near the saloon lowered his eyes toward the dirt. Elias finally spoke without looking up. "Leave it be, Nantan." The chief glanced back at him. "You still protect them." "They are frightened," Elias answered softly. "Fear makes men foolish." Old Walter Briggs removed his hat slowly near the saloon porch. "Chief," he said carefully, "folks here never knew what that old man meant to you." Nantan looked toward Walter. "You think this is about what he means to me?" Nobody spoke. The Apache chief turned again toward the town. 30 years ago, soldiers burned camps along the Verde River during winter snow. Children froze before sunrise. Families vanished into smoke. Several men shifted uncomfortably beneath his gaze. This man found a wounded Apache boy, hidden beneath a broken wagon, while cavalry searched the canyon trails. Nantan paused briefly. "That boy was me." The wind moved through town in a long, hollow breath. Elias stared toward the western hills while the memory passed silently across his face. "He carried me nearly 40 miles through snow and stone after his own horse collapsed. He gave me water while his own lips cracked from thirst. And when soldiers questioned him at a crossing near Dry Creek, he lied to save a child whose people were called enemies." Martha looked at Elias differently now, as though the old cowboy standing before her had suddenly become someone much larger than the tired man she thought she knew. Nantan stepped closer to Sheriff Mercer. Not threatening, just close enough for the sheriff to feel the weight of his presence. "Your father knew this story," the chief said quietly. Mercer's face drained pale. "What?" "Your father rode with those soldiers. He told Elias Boone to leave the child behind." The sheriff said nothing, but this man ignored him. Nantan looked back toward Elias again. "That choice spared more lives than any of you understand." Silence settled once more across Black Hollow. The same people who mocked the old cowboy yesterday now stood unable to meet his eyes. And there beneath the cold Arizona sky, Elias Boone looked less like a forgotten drifter and more like the kind of man history forgets too easily until truth finally rides back into town. Nobody in Black Hollow seemed to know what to do after that. The town stood caught between shame and fear while cold wind drifted through the empty street carrying the smell of smoke from the western hills. Men who had spent years talking loudly about courage now stared down at their boots like schoolboys waiting for punishment. Chief Nantan Lujan remained beside Elias Boone without another word, his calm presence somehow larger than anger itself. Sheriff Clyde Mercer finally stepped forward, though the movement looked forced. "If what you say is true," he began carefully, "then why did he stay hidden all these years?" Elias answered before Nantan could speak. "Because some things are better carried quietly." Mercer frowned. "You could have told people." The old cowboy looked toward the dusty storefronts lining Main Street. Would it have changed anything? Nobody answered him. Deep down, they all knew the truth. Probably would not have. Fear had always been easier than understanding. One of the younger ranch hands suddenly removed his hat and stepped forward slowly from the crowd near Doyle's saloon. It was the same young man who had opened the leather pouch the night before. His face looked pale beneath the morning light. "Mr. Boone," he said softly. "I did not know." Elias studied him for a moment before nodding once. "Most men do not." The ranch hand swallowed hard. "I should not have entered your home." The old cowboy looked away toward the western ridge where smoke still curled against the sky. "No," he said quietly. "You should not have." The words carried no cruelty. Somehow that made them cut deeper. Martha Hale stepped down from the stable porch and walked into the middle of the street. "You all wanted him gone yesterday," she said, her voice sharper now. "A man who never stole from any of you, never harmed any of you. A man who spent 20 years keeping to himself while half this town treated him like dirt beneath a boot heel." Several townspeople lowered their eyes. Even old Walter Briggs looked ashamed. Sheriff Mercer removed his hat slowly and wiped a hand across his face. He suddenly looked much older than he had the day before. "My father knew," he muttered quietly. Nantan nodded once. "Your father carried that guilt until his death." Mercer stared at Elias. "And you still stayed here." Elias rested a hand against the neck of his horse. This town needed peace more than it needed truth. The sheriff looked around at the silent faces lining Main Street. Then his gaze drifted back toward the western hills where Apache signal fires still burned faintly beneath daylight. "Those fires," he asked carefully. "Are there warriors out there?" Nantan turned toward the ridge for a long moment before answering. "Yes." The tension returned instantly. Hands tightened near gun belts. Horses shifted nervously beside the hitching rails. But the chief raised one hand calmly. "They came because they feared I rode alone into danger." Nobody breathed. "But they will not enter your town." Sheriff Mercer looked confused. "Why not?" Nantan glanced toward Elias Boone. "Because 30 years ago this man asked me for one thing in return for my life." The chief's dark eyes moved slowly across the frightened faces surrounding him. "He asked that no Apache blood ever stain Black Hollow." Silence. Deep and terrible silence. The people standing there finally understood what kind of man Elias Boone truly was. Not a traitor. Not a coward. A man who had protected people who never deserved it. The old cowboy adjusted the silver and bone necklace resting against his chest and sighed softly beneath the cold desert wind. "It was a long time ago," he murmured, but nobody in town could look at him the same way anymore. The smoke above the western ridge began thinning by late afternoon, and with it some of the fear inside Black Hollow slowly loosened its grip. But shame stayed behind. Shame settled deep into the town like dust inside old floorboards where no broom could reach it anymore. Folks moved quieter now. Men who had mocked Elias Boone only a day earlier suddenly found reasons to avoid looking toward the stable where the old cowboy stood beside Chief Nantan Lujan beneath the fading Arizona sun. Even Doyle's saloon remained half-empty through the afternoon. Nobody felt much like drinking. Sheriff Clyde Mercer walked slowly across Main Street with his hat hanging low in one hand. His boots dragged through the dirt as though the weight of his father's secret had somehow settled onto his own shoulders overnight. He stopped in front of Elias and looked at the old cowboy for several long seconds before speaking. "You saved my father too, did you not?" Elias adjusted the saddle blanket on his horse before answering. "Your father saved himself." Mercer shook his head faintly. "Nantan said you stopped bloodshed after Dry Creek." The old cowboy stared toward the western hills where sunlight burned gold against distant stone. Men were angry on both sides. Angry men bury too many sons. Sheriff Mercer swallowed hard. "And you carried that alone all these years?" Elias gave a tired shrug. "Somebody had to." The sheriff looked away after that. He could not hold the old man's eyes anymore. Near the saloon porch, the young ranch hand who had entered Elias's cabin the night before slowly approached carrying something wrapped in cloth. His face still looked uneasy. He stopped a few feet away and carefully unwrapped the object in his hands. The silver Apache medallion. Cleaned now. Polished carefully. "I should not have touched this," the young man said quietly. Elias looked at the medallion but did not reach for it immediately. "No," he answered softly. The ranch hand lowered his head. "My father taught me to fear Apache people before I knew anything about them." Chief Nantan watched him calmly. "Fear is taught early," the chief said. "Sometimes so is hate." The young man nodded once, unable to argue. Slowly Elias accepted the medallion and slipped it back into his coat pocket. No anger passed between them, no threats. Somehow that mercy left the young ranch hand looking worse than punishment ever could. Martha Hale stepped out from the general store carrying a fresh kettle of coffee and several tin cups. Without speaking, she began pouring coffee for anyone standing nearby, Apache chief included. Nobody objected. Not anymore. Nantan accepted the cup with a small, respectful nod. Around them the town remained strangely still. Horses swished their tails near the hitching rails. Wind moved softly through hanging signs overhead. Somewhere a church bell rang once in the distance. Then Chief Nantan reached beneath his coat and removed a long ceremonial knife resting in a leather sheath against his belt. Several townspeople stiffened immediately, old fear flashing across their faces again. But the chief simply walked to the center of Main Street and knelt slowly in the dust. He placed the knife carefully into the ground upright where sunlight caught the carved silver handle. "Among my people," Nantan said quietly, "a blade placed in the earth means the debt is finished." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. The chief stood again and turned toward Elias Boone. "You owed us nothing 30 years ago," he said. "Yet you gave everything anyway." Elias looked down at the knife resting silently in the dirt between them. His tired gray eyes reflected something close to sorrow. "I just carried a boy through the snow," he murmured. Nantan shook his head faintly. "No, you carried peace." And standing there beneath the fading desert light, surrounded by the same town that once wanted him gone, Elias Boone suddenly looked like the only man in Black Hollow who had never needed forgiveness from anyone. The next morning came softer than the ones before it. The smoke above the western ridge had finally faded during the night, leaving only a pale desert sky stretching wide and empty over Black Hollow. Wind moved gently through town now, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and sun-baked cedar instead of fear. Main Street looked quieter than usual beneath the early light. Storefront windows remained dark. Horses stood calm beside the hitching rails. Even Doyle's saloon had not opened its doors yet. Elias Boone stepped out of his cabin just after sunrise wearing his old brown coat and the silver and bone necklace resting against his chest. The Apache bead bracelet still circled his wrist beside skin weathered by 70 hard years beneath the Arizona sun. He paused for a moment on the porch, looking out across the town as though memorizing something already halfway gone. Then he picked up his saddlebag and walked slowly toward the stable. People watched him from a distance. Nobody hid it anymore. Martha Hale stood beside the general store holding a folded blanket in her arms. Old Walter Briggs removed his hat quietly as Elias passed him near the water trough. One by one, others did the same. No speeches came. No apologies large enough to fill what silence had exposed. Only hats lowered beneath the morning sun and eyes unable to meet the old cowboy's gaze for very long. Sheriff Clyde Mercer stepped out from the sheriff's office carrying his badge in one hand. The metal caught faint sunlight before he looked down at it with tired eyes. He crossed the street slowly toward Elias Boone. "I spent half my life trying to become my father," Mercer said quietly. "Turns out I inherited the wrong parts." Elias tightened the strap beneath his horse's saddle without answering right away. Finally, he looked at the sheriff and gave a faint shrug. "Every man gets another sunrise if he is lucky." Mercer stared at the badge in his hand for several long seconds. Then, without another word, he placed it gently on the hitching rail beside the stable and stepped back. Elias understood what the gesture meant. So did everybody else watching from the street. Near the edge of town, Chief Nantan Lujan waited beside his horse facing the western road. The morning wind moved softly through his dark hair while distant mountains glowed red beneath sunrise. No Apache warriors appeared on the ridge now. No smoke fires burned. Only open desert stretching toward the horizon. Elias mounted his old bay horse carefully, stiff from age but steady once seated in the saddle. Martha stepped forward, holding out the folded blanket. "Desert gets cold after dark," she said softly. Elias accepted it with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Martha." She looked at him for a long moment before asking the question nobody else dared speak aloud. "Will you ever come back?" Elias glanced slowly across Black Hollow one final time. The town that feared him, judged him, owed him more than it ever knew. Then his tired gray eyes drifted toward the western road, where Nantan waited beneath the morning light. "No," he answered gently. "I think my trail goes somewhere else now." Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody asked him to stay. That was the part that hurt most. Elias Boone touched the brim of his hat once toward the town and guided his horse forward. Chief Nantan turned beside him, and together the two riders started west toward the open desert beyond Black Hollow. One old cowboy, one Apache chief, riding side by side beneath the endless Arizona sky without another word between them. The people of Black Hollow stood silently in the street watching until both figures became shadows against the red horizon. Long after they disappeared, the ceremonial knife still rested upright in the dirt at the center of town where Nantan had left it the day before. Nobody touched it. Years later, folks would still speak quietly about the old cowboy who carried peace through snow and fire while the rest of the world kept searching for enemies. And whenever the desert wind moved through Black Hollow after sunset, some swore they could still hear distant hoofbeats fading slowly into the western dark.